2013, a couple years after graduating from undergrad, I decided to do the very impractical move and basically dive off the deep end and quit my job and focus on writing a novel for a few months. And aside from struggling financially, I didn't realize that I'd pick up some lessons that I'd bring with me to business school that I've surprisingly found to be extremely helpful. And I'd like to share 3 of those lessons today. The first is that creativity can come on demand. So this is an example of some of my notebooks on some works that I've been working on. And before, I felt like I could only write when I was inspired, and that happened like once every 3 years maybe. And recently, I actually heard a talk by Stephen King that really resonated with me, in which he said he too only writes when he's inspired. And he's inspired between the hours of 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. Monday through Friday. And this revealed to me 2 things. The first is that if you get rid of that filter in your mind that tells you this is not good enough to put on paper, you can create so many amazing things. And I found this to be extremely helpful when I'm trying to write a paper for school last minute. In addition to that, in addition to that, you can also put a stop on things too. Like sometimes I feel like if I'm on a roll, I need to keep going, even if it means that I've been awake for 38 hours without eating properly. And like, based on what Stephen King said, I can put a stop on things and continue to create. And if the idea is good enough, it'll still be there when I get back to it later. The second lesson is that nothing quite instills the value of humility like being in a writer's workshop. So I'll put up some examples of some comments that I received about my writing that maybe if I read this a few years ago, it would have torn me up and I would have stopped writing completely. But over the course of being in a writer's workshop, giving feedback, taking feedback, I realized that first of all, nobody's gonna steal your writing. Like, it's fine, you can share it. And second of all, you can get some really valuable feedback from people. So for example, I may have intended a scene to go a certain way, to resonate a certain way with people when I write it, but if all the responses I'm getting don't reflect that at all, it's okay for me to revisit it. It doesn't mean that I'm a bad writer. It doesn't mean that they're bad readers. It means that I'm not doing something right and I should fix it. And this is something that I found too to be valuable in thinking about performance review process and work. And thirdly is the power that science fiction has to inspire even in the world of business. So us being Booth type people, I have a couple of case examples to share. So the first is Paul Krugman. So he's a Nobel Prize winning economist, like we know well at Booth, although if you know his economics, he's not quite Chicago school. But he has shared, he shared in the past that what inspired him to get into economics was the Foundation series by Isaac Asimov, in which a core part of the story is this fictional science called psychohistory, in which mathematical models are applied to historical events, and then they use that insight to make predictions about the future, which sounds a little bit like economics. The second example is Amazon's Echo and the Alexa software that goes with it. And Jeff Bezos and other leadership at Amazon have been pretty open about sharing that the inspiration for the tool and the software was the computer from Star Trek. So if you just say computer, all of a sudden the Enterprise is mobilized and you can do whatever you want. And it's sort of similar with what you see in Amazon Echo and Alexa and IoT. So I kind of zipped through that because I want to make sure I had time to read a little bit of my work here. But I'll close out with this quote by Isaac Asimov, which talks about the possibilities that can be obtained through science fiction to become more critical about society and have a little bit of a futurist mindset to think about how we can make things better. So I'd like to share an excerpt of my science fiction novel in verse that I've been working on. So Magnus's stench pierced, a curation of sweat and dirt and rot that wove itself into the fine threads of Deco's olfactory memory. It was roughly the 4th day, or the 5th since Magnus died. The point where the living ended and the dying began had blended together. Deco measured her breaths, a staccato and a syncopation of her own meter. If only the grayscale that crept over Magnus wasn't so stark against the sugar and crumble of the coffee cake earth. Time wrapped Magnus's fingertips in a blue-black veil and pressed pretty bruisings like thumbprints over his eyelids, the flattened ones Deco taped down to keep shut. An autopsy was in order, Deco decided, as she dug into Magnus's breast pocket for the medical kit. A thin, white line of light flickered over Magnus's torso from the tripod-like structure Deco erected over his body. The beam eventually steadied, and the medical kit began to roll down for a scan. As the robotic voice of the kit announced its diagnosis, Deco couldn't help but feel a bit smug, which by then was a vestigial sort of feeling. Now that the boss was gone, it was just Deco left to face a merciless planet. Thank you.